Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We heard the president say earlier this year, and has said several times, that climate change is the biggest thing affecting Americans. It's not really terrorism, right? And we hear an awful lot about temperatures. The president and others have said, and many who are Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, doesn't matter, have said that temperatures are going up, and the world is we're going to have the melting of the glaciers and the ice in Alaska and the Antarctic and all that kind of stuff. You get all those stories. Well, John L. Casey's with us this morning. He's the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, a leading independent research organization in Orlando, Florida. They specialize in the science and planning for the next climate change to decades of cold weather, including its predicted concurrent ill effects of record earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. He's also a former national space policy advisor to the White House and Congress, a space shuttle engineer, consultant to NASA headquarters, and consultant to or president of several leading-edge technology startups. And he joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show this morning. John, great to have you on the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Gary. Thanks for having me.
You also have a brand new book out called Dark Winter, How the Sun is Causing a 30-Year Cold Spell. So, one of the things that I know you're concerned about is that they said temperature data is being faked to show global warming. Really?
Apparently so. I know there's a recent article that came out of the UK in the Telegraph by Christopher Booker, which specifically pointed to manipulation of historical data, which seemingly indicates that global warming is worse than we thought. Regardless whether the article by Mr. Booker was 100% accurate or only 75% accurate, the bottom line is still the same. We see a trend and reports by others as well that shows that government adjustments to temperature data seem to be biased in favor of global warming.
Now, let me ask you a question. And again, I'm one of those guys, I'm not going to pretend to say that I know a ton about this. I've read about it. You're a guy that's obviously studied a lot of this your whole life. How much effect do we have as human beings on global warming? I'm thinking the Earth has been around here millions and millions and millions of years, and compared to the amount of time the Earth has been around, human existence is like a speck on the continuum. So I'm wondering to myself, we've seen an awful lot of change. We've seen continental drift. We've seen, ice ages here, the whole kind of thing. Where are we right now with any kind of objective look at the Earth, and how much of an effect do we have as people who live here on the climate?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question the way you did, because if we look at what the government wants us to look at, the near decade or two past where we had some warming, we actually fall into the trap of not seeing the forest for the trees. But as you pointed out, we really have a long history on our planet of both geology and weather patterns. And if we understand these larger patterns and larger cycles, we have a much better way of understanding climate variation and, in fact, predicting future variation.
Now, if you look at where those patterns have been so far, can you break that down a little bit more for us and say, okay, here's kind of the pattern that we've seen, and here's maybe the expectation we could have?
Yes, indeed. In fact, the work that I announced back in 2007 really got very specific on identifying the individual cycles of the sun that most affect us and are in fact causing the current reversal from the past global warming to a new global cooling era. The particular cycle at play right now is a 206-year-long cycle of the sun. The last time this one was providing a cold phase was 1793 to 1830. Historian John D. Post said the loss of crops worldwide from the cold was so bad it was the world's greatest subsistence crisis at that time. Oh. And we're forecasting the same thing with this new cold phase of this 206-year cycle.
Now, when would it start? When would it end, roughly? I mean, if we're looking at those kind of models in that kind of time period.
The 206-year cycles, cold effects have already begun and are well realized. That's why we've had a number of brutal winters in the last 6 winters, and why the global temperature trends, both oceanic and atmospheric, are now all in the cold phase. In fact, the Space and Science Research Corporation that I head publishes every 6 months a global climate status report. In that report, we examine 24 different climate parameters. Of those 24 in the last report, 15 are now in cold phase, and we expect the remainder to go cold within the next 5 years.
You know, one of the things, John, that you talk about here is you go back and you look at how, you know, all this whole climate change thing got started, 30 or so years ago. And you talk about the $30 billion that has been spent in an attempt to make what always has been kind of a weak scientific theory into something valid. Take us back a little bit and get us started on that. And how did it all get started? And talk about the $30 billion that was spent here on trying to make us believe that we had, first of all, what's called global warming. Now it's called climate change. It sounds a little more innocuous, I guess. But take us back and get us started on that and take us through that 30 years. Can you do that?
Certainly. The fundamental impetus, like most, is following the money. If you go back and look at what was going on in Great Britain back in the mid-'80s, you'll see that they were having to contend with coal miner strikes, and that was devastating the economy. The solution was to come up with something to get them off of coal and go nuclear. That solution was dredging up a 110-year-old climate theory called the greenhouse gas theory, and it was tied, of course, to CO2 emissions from coal plants. That became the modus operandi for the last 30 years within the environmental community, within the global socialism community, because it became the perfect tool to regulate industry worldwide, to regulate people's property rights and individual rights, and so caught on quite rapidly. The UN picked it up. It became a major tool for the United Nations to affect change in countries around the world. And then Bill Clinton imported it here to the U.S., and of course now President Obama and Al Gore have really pushed this thing even harder. But that's when it got started, and it was because someone decided to put money into it back in the mid-'80s.
So climate change is about power, for all intents and purposes.
Very much about power. It was really never about the science at all. In fact, the leading advocates of the program back then said they really didn't care if the science panned out as being valid. They were really after trying to save the planet, trying to redistribute wealth, trying to impose taxes and controls over the people. They made that very clear, and surprisingly, the mainstream media kind of downplayed that and played up, in fact, the supposed threats from man-made climate change via CO2 emissions.
One of the things I haven't understood over the years, and I guess maybe I have understood it in a way, I see people talking about their footprint, and I know we've had all kinds of efforts to put caps on factories and so forth that they say are spewing too much pollution and that kind of thing. And what has been interesting to me on that has been many times, okay, you really don't have to change, but you got to pay up if you don't. You got to pay a penalty. So I'm thinking to myself, if it were about the climate change, and if it were about taking care of our atmosphere, and if it were about taking care of the climate, wouldn't you be more concerned about making them change than you would be about having them pay a penalty? And if they're paying a penalty, someone's getting that money, right?
Well, that's right. And again, it's a follow the money story. The carbon credit exchanges that have sprung up point to the fact that it's really about the money and not the science, because in many cases these carbon credits do absolutely nothing for the companies or for the environment. It's all about redistributing money from those who have it and corporations that have it to those who don't and really haven't earned it.
We're talking with John L. Casey this morning, former White House National Space Policy Advisor and the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation. why should people, and I'll ask you a tough question here, John, why should people believe you? And there are so many scientists out there, and people say, well, I've listened to these people, and this is what they say. What makes you different? How are you different in terms of how you approach this?
Well, that's probably the best question I get when I give presentations throughout the country. It's what I call, where's the beef on climate science.
Right.
The answer is actually pretty simple. You can believe in the greenhouse gas theory that mankind's CO2 drives climate change, and all of that interpreted via models that predict climate variation. If you look at those models, you find that they are utterly unreliable and failures from a scientific standpoint. The error rates vary from 90% to over 300% in error. These aren't science theories at that point. They're almost like gambling. On the other hand, if you follow people like me around the world who use solar cycles and solar activity with over 90% reliability in predicting major climate change, then you see we've got a very different picture. So the question boils down to track record. Who's been accurate? Who's been providing the best science? It's certainly not the UN. It's certainly not the president. But it seems to be among those who study the sun as the driver of climate change.
When you hear the president say, and you hear others say, 90% of scientists say that climate change is real, and so it's settled, there can't be any argument about that, what's your reaction?
Well, what's happened, and it began back in 07 and 08, shortly after my first press release, the term global warming got put aside in favor of, as you pointed out, climate change per se. And the attempt was based on the fact that we had a news conference, we announced the end of global warming, and immediately everyone picked up on that and said, well, if global warming isn't with us anymore, we might as well try to do something else. And so the smoke and mirrors term, climate change, now applies to just about anything. So whether it's cooling or warming, whether we have extreme weather events like drought or hurricanes, now supposedly mankind is responsible for any climate variation. And, of course, it's all about politics. It's all about maintaining control.
Right. You know, it was interesting the other day. Someone said to me, don't you believe in climate change? I said, absolutely, I believe in climate change. I think the world's changing all the time. I said, obviously, if you look back at history, you'd have to be a blithering idiot not to believe that there's climate change. Where I fall short is I don't believe that we are responsible for all the climate change. To me, that takes an incredible amount of arrogance to think that on a world that has been so resilient for millions of years that we can have that much effect. Now, do I think that we have some effect? Do I think we should be good stewards? Yeah, I do. But your thoughts on that? That was the answer that I gave. I don't know if it's a good answer or it was a bad answer. Was it a good answer?
That's an outstanding answer. We need to distinguish between pollution and saving the planet's climate. We certainly have ongoing pollution problems in the water and the atmosphere. I just got back from a documentary being done on my work out in L.A., and there is still smog out there, and that's because of the local weather combined with industrial and automotive exhaust gas that creates that smog. So, we still have those kinds of issues to deal with, but it's totally unrelated to climate. What we now know after the 30 years of effort and over $30 billion spent right here in the U.S. alone on climate research is that the planet, its atmosphere and oceans are almost indifferent to how much CO2 we have.
Right.
We know that the long history of our planet shows that there are times when we've had 10 times the amount of CO2, and yet we've had glaciers. Well, if CO2 creates warming, which would prohibit glaciers, you certainly couldn't have that. And the reverse is true. We've had times when we've had several times the amount of CO2, and yet plant and animal life thrived to a great degree. So even in the last climate report from the United Nations, they finally eliminated the CO2 sensitivity as a major factor in climate variation, when in fact in all prior reports it was the primary pillar. So even now the corrupt and unreliable climate reports from the UN recognize that the climate may not really care how much CO2 we have.
We're talking with John L. Casey, the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, and a guy that's been studying climate change for a long time. John, we're going to come back, and I want to kind of close out with you a little bit here and look at how people react to you that are the 90% of scientists out there who say climate change is real. John L. Casey will be back with us here on the Gary Sutton Show right after this on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We're with John L. Casey this morning, who is the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, a leading independent research organization on climate change in Orlando, Florida. He's also written a brand new book called Dark Winter, How the Sun is Causing a 30-Year Cold Spell. And, John, if I look at the title of that book, you know, it's kind of at odds for me because I say a dark winter, how the sun is causing a 30-year cold spell. You think the sun will cause a 30-year warm spell, right?
Exactly, but when you look at exactly what's happening with the sun, we see that when the sun is very active, we have global warming, and when the sun is not active and in fact is cutting back on its energy output, then the Earth gets cold.
You know what's interesting to me is I hear a lot of people who talk about all these different things with climate change, and sometimes I find myself saying, that's silly. Now, again, I say it guardedly because I think I'm humble enough to say I don't know a whole lot about this stuff, and I don't pretend that, you know, it's kind of like the people that think history began when they were born, will end when they die. It's kind of a very narrow look at it and a rather arrogant look at what's going on around us. And so I look at it and I say, okay, people get nuts when they see hurricanes in a given year or winter's cold, and I say, you know what? It's winter. It gets cold in the winter. Summertime, it gets hot. It's not climate change. It is climate change, but it just is climate change that we can pretty much predict. So when the 90% of people who think that climate change is real and we are responsible for all of it and we need to do all these things to cut down on it, what do those 90% say about you? Because obviously you're a guy that says, you know, I'm kind of rejecting a lot of your models that you're putting out there based on other things, and I'm basing mine on what's happened here as far as we can determine it over the history of the Earth.
Well, certainly, if you look back in history, you find that any time someone stands up to the establishment or the dogma of the day, whether it be in politics or science or any other field, there's a typical set of reactions. They're initially ignored, then they become attacked, and then ultimately truth wins out and everyone says, oh, well, we knew that guy was right all along. So I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. It certainly is proceeding that way since I began my first pronouncements, predictions, and press releases back in 2007. I will tell you I was severely criticized. I was called a scam artist, a hoax, a fraud. And this was after several decades, mostly in the space program, working at the highest levels of our government. So it was kind of different for me to see that kind of thing. But now, after almost 8 years of predicting climate change and being independently evaluated as having one of the best climate prediction records, if not the best in the U.S., that story is starting to change. Scientists have been joining with me over the years, and my book, Dark Winter, is now the #1 selling global cooling book on Amazon. So things are improving. The word is getting out. And the reality of predicting the climate with over 90% accuracy using solar cycles seems to be winning some hearts and minds.
How do you, because, you know, we hear a lot of people that they seem to have a certain ideology going in, and that ideology kind of says, okay, here's where I want this to go, and then I'll conveniently fill in underneath to make sure it gets there. Have you ever found yourself fighting that kind of thing, or as a person that's in science, do you say, well, you know, there's going to lead somewhere, and wherever it leads, you know, I'll follow? How do you look at that and keep, you know, your individual, maybe your thoughts about something or ideology, I want to find a better word, from affecting the kinds of things that you're following here in terms of climate change?
Well, the separation between ideology and science is in constant debate. It has been since Galileo was put into house arrest by Pope Urban for saying that the sun was at the center of the solar system instead of the Earth. But we're seeing that even today where politics and science don't agree. The science is, in fact, very clear, not settled, of course. It never should be. But the science is now very clear that mankind has an insignificant role in climate change, that the sun is, in fact, the primary cause of climate change, cooling and warming, and that the current efforts of the UN, our own government, are obviously based on achieving political goals and not really based on the solid science, the proven science, and the science that gives us and people like our group the best climate prediction record in the U.S.
So when we hear politicians telling us that it's settled now and there's no more arguing about it, maybe we ought to kind of say, hang on for a second here. Every time politics seems to touch something, it seems to tinge it just ever so slightly, right?
Exactly. So we need to be very cautious when we have politicians talk about settled science. You see a lot of myths that have come out.
Right.
As a result, the polar bears going extinct, an absolute myth. Their numbers are now 250% greater. There are instances of polar bears being overpopulated now in some areas of Canada. You look at the so-called 97% of scientists' consensus.
And
that was an absolutely bogus study.
Yeah, I'll have to end it right at that point. The name of the book is Dark Winter, How the Sun is Causing a 30-Year Cold Spell. John, it's been fascinating talking to you. I appreciate it. Appreciate your work. Thank you so much for taking time to share with us this morning.
Thank you, Gary.
Take care now. John L. Casey with us on the Gary Sutton Show.